I'm Beth Gottesman, the Midwest Regional Director. We welcome all of you, literally from all over the world. We have people joining us from coast to coast in the US and Canada, as well as
I
Manchester.
just tuned into Laura's thing, but the volume doesn't really work.
Thank you to Laura Cohen-Silberman and Nachiel Solvan, who will be inspiring us today. This program is in loving memory of Anita Scharf and Eleanore Greenberg, two women who have dedicated their lives to benefit Amit's children. I would like to introduce Miriam Colum, Eleanore Greenberg's daughter. Miriam was born into Amit and has been involved ever since. Take it away, Miriam.
Hello, and welcome to Amit's 9 Days program, which we hope will help us all prepare for the upcoming fast of Tisha B'Av. My name is Miriam Colum, and I live in Chicago, where I have witnessed personally the tremendous work the Chicago Amit chapter does for its children in Israel. Today's program is in memory of two women who were both dedicated to Amit, my mother, Eleanore Greenberg, and Anita Scharf, Laura's grandmother. Although I'm not sure if they knew each other, any friend of Amit was a friend of my mother's. Every year at the time of my mother's yahrzeit, Amit in Chicago has the Eleanore Greenberg Memorial Lecture. My family and I have always been deeply honored to pay tribute to her in this way. But more importantly, I know how thrilled my mother would be if she knew that she is still helping Amit. It was over her life's work. I do not exaggerate when I say that not a single day went by where she wasn't thinking about some way to raise money for Amit. It was very important to her that people should know what Amit does because their work is so essential and so incredible. Years ago, when I would tell her I was going to an Amit meeting for my Efrat chapter, she would hand me a stack of papers filled with the personal stories of the children that had been helped by Amit. Please make sure to pick something and read it at the meeting. It's important for everyone to know what they are doing. I could go on and on about my mother and how hard she worked for Amit, but here I am now at one of the biggest Amit meetings I've ever been to, and I don't think this is how she would want me to use this precious time with all of you Amit members gathered from all over the world to attend this event. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Amit. Jewish values, a holistic educational philosophy, academic excellence, and a 21st century approach to learning have been the hallmarks of Amit's core values since its inception. We educate more than 37,000 students who come from differing backgrounds, and regardless of their religiosity or where they come from, they get our all. We level the playing field. We make sure our kids have access to the best of what we can give them, access to things they otherwise would not have. Maybe that's why we've been Israel's #1 network, voted by the Ministry of Education 3 years in a row. Our aim is to create the next generation of proud Jews who are connected to their people and land, and who are well equipped to thrive in the 21st century to ensure strong Israel for generations to come. Today's event in particular is very much the essence of what we do at Amit, as exemplified by our scholars today. We teach Torah studies to all of our students, male and female. Most recently, we have put a new emphasis on teaching Gemara to our girls at Amit schools. With much pride, we had a sizable representation at the first Women's Siyum Hashas in Jerusalem this past January. The 3,000 women in attendance, more than 200 were our Amit girls from our midrashot and from our high schools. Many of our students in preparation for the event took on learning Daf Yomi on their own to participate in this very historic gathering. It was a very special and moving experience for them. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Laura Honig-Silberman. Ms. Silberman is originally from Teaneck, New Jersey. She made Aliyah after studying in Midrashet Lindenbaum for 2 years. She went on to pursue a BA in social work at Bar Ilan University while studying at the Bar Ilan Midrashah. She also completed the Lindenbaum Educators Program and has taught at a number of midrashot in Yerushalayim. As a clinical social worker, she has focused on teens at risk and has worked with all sectors of Israeli society, secular, religious, and Haredi. Laura was working with adolescents and addictions in Gush Etzion prior to her current role as a shlicha for Mizrahi UK in Manchester, alongside her husband and 4 children. Ms. Silberman is the daughter of Donna Honig and granddaughter Anita Scharf, whose memory we honor today. Without further ado, I would like to present to you Laura Honig-Silberman. Please enjoy.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much. It is a huge honor to be here and to speak Li'iloi Nishmat Chana Bat Yehuda V'Rachel, my grandmother Anita Scharf. Today I would like to speak about the link between Tisha B'Av and Tu B'Av. As we see in the first source in Talmud Bavli, Masechet Ta'anit Daf Chav Vav Amud Bet. בתשעה באב נגזר על אבותינו שלא ייכנסו לארץ, וחרב הבית בראשונה ובשנייה, ונלכדה ביתר, ונחרשה העיר. We see that on Tisha B'Av there was the decree that our forefathers that were wandering in the desert, the ones that had sinned from the sin of the spies, they were not allowed to enter into Eretz Israel. Their entire generation was wiped out before the entrance. And we also know that both of the temples were destroyed exactly on the state, that Beitar, the city, was trapped, was destroyed, and that Yerushalayim was plowed, which gives us this imagery of a city being plowed, completely uprooted, completely destroyed. If we look down on our source sheet just a few lines later, we see that the Gemara draws a connection to Tu B'Av as well. If we look here in the bold language, Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Lo hayu yamim tovim liYisrael k'chamisha b'Av u'biyom HaKippurim. There were not such great days for Israel like the days of the 15th of Av and Yom Kippur, shebahem benot Yerushalayim yotzot b'chli lavan she'ulim. That was the day that the girls would go out and dance, and they would wear these beautiful white dresses that they would borrow from one another. And the reason why they borrowed these dresses from one another is that so that no one would feel left out if she didn't have her own. So nobody wore their own dress. Rather, they would borrow each other's dresses. And we'll get into that a bit more later on. In the context of discussing what we celebrate on Tu B'Av, the Yerushalmi describes the devastating state that the nation was in the Midbar, in the 40 years in the Midbar, after the decree, what would happen every Tisha B'Av. And as explained in this second source in the Yerushalmi of Ta'anit, it would say that Moshe would motzi kruz b'chol ha'machaneh ve'omer tzu'u lichfor. He would say, make his proclamation in all of the camp, everybody go out and dig your graves, go and dig. And what would they do? They would dig their graves and they would sleep in their graves. And in the morning, they would wake up and each person would check, am I still alive? And 15,000 people would die each year on Tisha B'Av. And then what happened on the last year? Uv'shana ha'achorona asu chen, they did the same thing on the last year. Ve'amdu umatzu atzman shlemim. And they found themselves that they were still complete, that nobody had died, no one had passed away. And so what did they do? They thought, maybe it's possible that we miscalculated. Maybe it's not really Tisha B'Av. So let's sleep in our graves again this night. And they did that every night, on the 10th, on the 11th, on the 12th, the 13th, 14th, until they came to Tu B'Av, the 15th of the month. Kevan da'ashlem zihara, and that's when they saw that it was a complete moon, so they knew that they had calculated the date correctly, that they were in the middle of the month, and they said, Amru domeh shebitel HaKadosh Baruch Hu ota gzera kasha me'aleinu ve'amdu v'asu yom tov. And they understood that it was that day that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had taken away that horrible decree. And they stood up and they made this day of the Yom Tov. Now, from what we see from this description of the Yerushalmi, it's a very difficult description to really stomach this and to imagine that for 38 years they were wandering in the desert and every year they were digging their own graves. We cannot help but this imagery evokes imagery that we have from the Holocaust of Jews digging up their own graves. And we see here this utter despair that the nation really went through during those times. And so in addition to that decree being ended, right, in addition to the fact that they realized that on Tu B'Av, the decree had finally ended, and that they were able to get up and move forward. What else happened on Tu B'Av? What are these 6 reasons? What are the reasons that we have to celebrate on Tu B'Av? And how are all of these 6 reasons connected to each other and also connected to Tisha B'Av? If we look at the next source, Talmud Bavli Ta'anit, Masechet Ta'anit, we see here that it's elaborated 6 reasons, and what the first reasons, Yom Shutru Shvatim Lavo Zeh B'Zeh, as we see in the underline, it was the day that the Shvatim, after the first generation that entered into Israel, they were not allowed to intermarry between tribes. It was the day that that was taken away, and they were suddenly able to marry, to have cross-tribal marriages, as we would say. And the second reason that we celebrate this day, this is the day that the Shevet of Binyamin was allowed to come into the Kahal. They were allowed to join into the nation of Israel. And it was also the day that the people had stopped dying out in the Midbar, as we just said further. But in connection with that, in juxtaposition to that idea of the day that the deaths had ceased in the Midbar, it says, Ad shelo kalu matei midbar lo haya dibor im Moshe. Until they finished being wiped out in the desert, there was no direct communication with Moshe. The only communication that God spoke with Moshe was through the Urim V'Tumim, but there was no speech. The communication had been severed, and God hadn't spoken to him. And only once, we see in the Psukim, only once had they finished dying out that generation, God speaks to Moshe once again. And again, another reason that we see here is the day that Hoshea ben Elah, one of the kings of Israel, he took away the guards that Yeravam had put along the pathways so that the nations of Israel would not go up to Yerushalayim, would not go up to the temple. Yeravam, an evil king, was so threatened by the kingdom of Jerusalem that he made sure that his people would not go to the Beit HaMikdash, and he put guards on the way to stop people from going up to the temple. This was the day on Tu B'Av that Hoshea took away those guards and opened the pathway so that they could go up to Yerushalayim. Another reason is Yom Shenatnu Harugei Beitar L'Kvura. This is the day that the people that were killed in Beitar, after in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, after the destruction of the second temple, when they tried to rebel against the Romans, and they fought fiercely for the land of Israel. Unfortunately, there was a battle that we did not win, and they were destroyed, but they were not allowed to bury their dead, and their dead just lay, the corpses lay, and that was the day that we were allowed to bury the dead, and there was a miracle that the corpses had not decomposed, and that Hashem had allowed, through the Romans uplifting that decree, they were allowed to be buried. And the last reason that we celebrate Tu B'Av is Yom Shepasku Milichrot Eitzim L'Ma'aracha. It was the day that they completed breaking down branches to burn on the Mizbeach. They would break down branches, but the branches needed to be dry enough. And the moment that the branches were not dry enough, then they would be filled with worms, and they would be puzzled. They wouldn't be allowed to be used in order to be used on the Mizbeach. So from here we see that there's these 6 different reasons, and we try to come to understand what is the connection between these reasons, right? What they seem so kind of different, right? There's decrees being canceled, there's marriage between tribes, there's trees, we're not cutting them down anymore. What could possibly be the connection between all of these, and also between Tisha B'Av? So I'd like to bring in some ideas that Rav Yair Khan brings in. And he explains that Tisha B'Av is different from the other public fasts. And he draws a distinction between a tzara, which is a calamity, and a gzera, which is a decree. And he explains that according to the Rambam, that the verse in Bamidbar, which tells us how we blow our trumpets if there's war and if we have enemies that are bothering us, this includes tefillah and petition. This is all part of tshuva. And in the times of calamity, in the times of tzara, we are meant to repent from our evil ways. We are meant to recognize that this tzara has come upon us for that purpose, to shake us, right? To tell us, wake up, look at yourself in the mirror, try to understand why this is befalling you, what is going on. And so therefore you do this to do tshuva, and that will cause the calamity to be uplifted. So the obligation of prayer and tshuva is also extended to obligated us in fasting as well. And the whole source of this idea of fasting and davening and tshuva, it's coming from the divine providence, which is calling us right? Begging us, Shufu Banim, return to me. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is begging us, please come back to me, mend your ways, and return to me. But in contrast to a calamity, a gezerah is something that cannot be removed. This is a decree that happens, right? And the decree expresses this idea of Hester Panim, of God hiding his face, of this distance between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In Brachot, Lamed Bet Amud Bet, it says that since the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, there is this wall of iron between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that the gates of prayer are locked. On Tisha B'Av, there was the decree that our forefathers could not enter Israel. But on other fast days, they're really meant to be days of prayer, slichot, kriyot we have. But on Tisha B'Av, we don't have that. We sit on the floor, we say Echa, we read Kinot. There's no Ne'ilah, there's no 24 brachot, there's no Anenu. It is a day of mourning. But after Chatzot, that starts to change. After Chatzot and Tisha B'Av, we start to see certain changes, that Titkabel is included, and Anenu is included in Mincha, and the regular Kriyot for the fast days. And we ask ourselves this question, how can we start to soften this mourning? We're sitting on the floor, we're crying over this decree that was made eons ago, right? On Tisha B'Av in the desert. And we're sitting there and we're crying and we're mourning. And we ask ourselves this question, how can we possibly go on? And so too, after the Gezerah and the Midbar, they also had that question. Every year when they were burying, they were digging their graves, when they were burying their loved one, they also had that question. How can we possibly move on after such a decree? And that utter despair that we see. But then comes along Tu B'Av, where there's the full moon, and they realize that decrees can pass, that there is a future. And that idea of Tu B'Av brings about that idea of this regeneration that is within us. And we see this theme of regeneration in all of the reasons that we listed above in the Gemara, why we celebrate Tu B'Av. We see this idea in how the communication is restored between Hashem and Moshe, that they can speak together. Hashem will appear to Moshe once again, and they can further that brit that they had. The burial of the people of Beitar shows Hashem's rachamim, his mercy, that even in the despair of the times of Bar Kokhba, we could see God's providence. And also in the marriages between the tribes of Shevet Binyamin, and also with Hoshea removing the soldiers along the way, we see that we're healing rifts among the nation, cracks between us. And the intertribal marriage is showing this growth, right? This flourishing between the nation. We're just going to grow. We're just going to develop. We're going to move forward. And as well, the last reason that the time of Tu B'Av, when you look at the context of the season, you can see that at first when they were breaking, the summer is a time, and Av is the summer where it's really hot, especially in Israel, heat wave after heat wave, and it's really dry, and rain is really the time that we see the providence of Hashem. And so we ask ourselves in that time, where is rain? Where is that providence? Where is Hashem? Is there hope? And suddenly Tu B'Av comes along and there's moist in the air, and so we can no longer cut down the trees to use them for the Mizbeach because the moist will cause the tolaim to come about. So Tu B'Av is really about turning a decree into a calamity, right? Because a calamity is something that we can pray for to be changed. And we turn our mourning, which is the static state of sitting on the floor, into prayer, into tefillah for change as well. So after Chatzot, we see that the sparks of hope are starting to appear after Chatzot and Tisha B'Av. And as long as we know that the decree is horrible and we must mourn it, but that the decree passes, just as they understood in the desert. And Tu B'Av is the day where the deaths had ceased in the Midbar, and it's that power of renewal, of continuation. And I would like to conclude with this beautiful imagery in the Talmud Bavli of the women that were going out and they were dancing in the vineyards, and the men would choose their wives, and it was really this day that was focused on love, and that's really the word that I would like to focus on. You know, people say describe yourself in one word, and whenever people ask me that question, I kind of freeze, and how can I possibly do that? But when I think of my grandmother, Anita Scharf, I can describe her in one word, and that word is love. And really, that's what Tu B'Av, right, which is the tikkun, which comes after Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed for hatred. Tu B'Av comes, and it's the antithesis. It's the opposite. It's the tikkun. It's that day of love, the day of unity, the day of connection to Israel, as Rav Aviner explains, and to the Beit HaMikdash, that this love, that it really describes my grandmother. After my grandfather, Zichrona Livracha, after he left the ashes of Dachau as fighting as an American soldier during World War II, the time of utter darkness in our history, while they would, during those years, they would write love letters to one another throughout all of these years, throughout this horrible time of war, he returned from this destruction to my grandmother, to Nana, Zichrona Livracha, and they built a family that was founded on love and faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Nana's unconditional love, and it was and still is felt by her children and her grandchildren constantly on an everyday basis. And if you look at both of her children, my Uncle Kenny and my mother Donna, they have both founded their families based on these tenets of that idea of love, that idea of the joy of dancing in the vineyard, and that idea of having that emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and realizing that after destruction, after the decree has passed, we can move forward, we can rejuvenate, and we can regenerate. Thank you. I would like now to move on to our next speaker, Marit Wolf, who, with her husband Joseph, co-sponsored this event today in honor of their mothers, Yehudit Greenspan, Zichrona Livracha, and Shelley Wolf, Zichrona Livracha. Marit belongs to the Ra'anana chapter of Amit. Please take it away.
In various projects for Amit Israel as part of the Ra'anana chapter. But my family's biggest connection to Amit is that 4 out of our 5 children graduated from Amit schools, and our 5th and youngest is set to graduate, please God, in the coming year. When I saw the Amit session with Nachliel back in April, I really just tuned in because I was bored at the end of a very long day, yet again stuck in the house. I didn't think I would be particularly interested in the exodus from ancient Egypt and modern New York. Ancient history is really not my thing, but Nachliel blew me away with his interesting and fun and educational view all at once. It was really a fabulous Zoom session. So I jumped at this chance to sponsor another Amit Zoom session with Nachliel, and my husband and I thought it fitting to dedicate it in honor of 2 very special women in our lives, Yehudit Greenspan, who has always had a love for learning, specifically the history of Jews in ancient times. I grew up in a house where the Biblical Archaeology Review was a mandatory subscription, and my mother-in-law, Shelley Wolf, who's an active member of Amit Jerusalem and often gives of her time to help Amit out. As a former librarian and teacher, Shelley Wolf has always brought a love of learning to both her students and children. Now, Nachliel Selavan, who is originally from Jerusalem's Old City, is back in Israel after 7 years of teaching full-time in the United States, developing his unique and engaging method of learning Torah through tour, travel, and archaeology. And I have to say, America's loss is our gain in Israel. Nachliel created and delivered an integrated learning and museum tour program in Israel, for both schools and adult education settings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and has hosted similar pilot visits to a dozen museums in North America and a few museums in Europe and in Jerusalem. He also teaches and engages audiences through virtual tours and social media, and has recently joined a Tanakh study podcast called Parsha Study Plus, delivering a weekly episode of archaeology on the Parsha. We are really all in for a treat today. Without further ado, I turn it over to Nachliel.
Thank you very much, Mirit, and thank you everybody for your sponsorship and for allowing me this opportunity. And I'll mention that my bubby, my mother's mother, my grandmother, is also here from Atlanta, and I can see the smiles on her face. I'm going to just share my screen so we can get started. There we go. And I'm going to be switching between the slideshow and between Google Earth, and sometimes that just takes a few moments, but I'm trying to minimize the dizziness. All right. So I'm going to kick off with some of Laura's talk, where her beautiful Torah, where she spoke about Tu B'Av and Tisha B'Av, and how we arose from the ashes to rebuild. And that's really what we're hoping that this Tisha B'Av is going to be. It's going to be a celebration and not a day of mourning. And what I would like to do in this brief tour from Rome to Jerusalem, or rather from Jerusalem to Rome and back to Jerusalem, is to show how the rebirth of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael in the form of the return to Israel and the state of Israel and all of that has its connections to our exile, and how we use those symbols and all of the history and the story invested in them when we recreated the state and tried to connect our identity to all that came before us. Okay, so I'm going to get started. So the first thing I'm going to do now, as I did warn you, is I'm going to share a different screen. Okay, so now, hang on. Okay, so you should now be seeing Google Earth. And what I'm going to do is give you an overview of what we're going to be seeing. And hopefully this should run smoothly, even though occasionally when you hit a button, it jumps around a little bit. So we're starting from a few important sites in Jerusalem, in my neighborhood. And I'm going to also share some personal stories of Jerusalem as I grew up in it. We're going to go from there to the Colosseum of Rome and the Arch of Titus, and then back to Jerusalem with all of those things that we've done. So let's get started with Jerusalem. It would be a lot of fun to have the effect of zooming and moving around with Google Earth, which is really cool, but that would make us dizzy, especially given the short amount of time that we have. So we are right now looking at a model known as the Holy Land model of the Second Temple period Jerusalem. It's currently in the Israel Museum. It's no longer in Holy Land. And this model is a fairly accurate, though there are some debates about the details, a fairly accurate representation of what Jerusalem looked like at its height. I'm going to move around a little bit. I'm having a lot of noise there in the background. Can anybody please mute yourselves? Thank you. So moving around a little bit so you get a sense of the massive walls, and especially the Temple Mount. We are now looking at what would be the south of the Temple Mount, what's known today as the City of David. Down here, this is the Kidron Valley to the east. The east is actually the main entrance to the temple. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, when you would be coming in from the Mount of Olives, which is also called Mount Scopus because you view Jerusalem as you would be coming in from the east. This is looking into the main sanctuary and the Kodesh Kodashim, the Sanctum Sanctorum of the temple. It is facing west, which is the opposite of what the entire pagan world was doing early on, which is praying to the sun and the constellations, which rises in the east. So it's kind of like Jews are always the counterculture, right? So the western wall is actually facing the back of the Heichal. Now let's move around to see a few sites that we're going to actually get to in a little more detail. This is all outdoors in the Israel Museum, and you can, of course, go see it when it's open. Oh, this is also good. Okay, so looking at Jerusalem, I'm going to zoom in a little bit. You see there's a lot of very Roman-like structures, and that's as far as we know. This was reconstructed based on some archaeology, a lot of writing from that time. We have the letter of Aristeas, we have Josephus, and we have several different Roman historians who describe Jerusalem. And so there's a bit of an argument about some details, but this is generally speaking pretty accurate. And some of the things in Jerusalem were built up very close to the destruction. And in fact, the reconstruction of the temple, which I'll get into in a bit, continued into its destruction. In other words, it never was completely finished. Now, the temple, as you can see, is a massive platform. And I want to focus on a few aspects of this before we go in a little bit deeper. So the plaza, the Temple Mount, as it's known today, has been expanded twice. When Ezra and Nehemiah came back during the Persian period, we're talking about after the Babylonian destruction, after the story of Purim, when the temple was completed, it was a very small temple on a small mound known as Mount Moriah. But the Hasmonean kings became rich and had a little more autonomy, and they were able to expand the width or the surface of the Temple Mount. And Herod the Great, we're talking about from the year 4 before the Common Era, 4 BCE, started rebuilding the temple into something that massive, and something which rivaled the greatest temples of the Roman world at the time. And there are many descriptions, again, from Aristeas to Josephus and so on, which describe the lavishness, and no amount of money was spared for making this a magnificent temple. And that is going to come into play later when we get to Rome and we talk about the impact of that. Now, I want to show one area here. This area here with all these red rooftops, these shingles, is actually today's old city of Jerusalem. It's the west. And so this area is the western wall we're looking at here, about in the center of the screen. This is a small fragment of this is what's currently visible, because later on, many buildings were built against the wall to sort of cover it up. Now, I'm pointing out one bridge over here that's currently in the center of this. This bridge is called Robinson's Arch, and the reason it's called Robinson's Arch is because Robinson named it so. Further in is Wilson's Arch, and if you go into the men's section under the tunneled area on the left, you can see it on the top. But we're going to go and see what remains of this. Now, there were several different entrances into the Temple Mount, into the Har HaBayit, and a lot of the structures came down, were destroyed during the destruction of the year 70 of the Common Era, which is when the temple was eventually destroyed and burned. So I'm going to get into that and a few more stories. What I would like to do now is take you into one area here of the aristocracy, of the upper class, the Kohanim, the priests. I myself am a Kohen as well. And I want to show you the inside of their houses and reflect on how that deals with different images we're going to see later on. So before we get that, I mentioned Robinson's Arch. So we are standing right now at what is known as the Ophel excavations. It's a park. There's a lot of things to see here today. And looking up, all the way up, if you look carefully, you'll see the remainder of a supportive structure and the beginning of the arch, which supported a staircase into one of the western entrances into the Temple Mount. And this was called, again, Robinson's Arch. Now, I think it was in the 1970s that a discovery was made. Right here below, you can see the pavement from the original Roman street. This was all a marketplace. So if you read, for example, the famous story in the New Testament about Yeshke, who was turning over the tables of the bankers who were taking commissions and so on. That happened very likely in this area, because this area is the marketplace. And the reason I'm mentioning the New Testament is even though we're Jewish, it's because the New Testament describes to you daily life of Jews in Jerusalem eve of the destruction. So it has historic value in that sense. You can go into all kinds of details there in terms of even the kinds of foods that were used and so on. Now, this hole in the pavement is actually from the collapse of these massive, colossal stones. Some of them weigh tens of tons, which fell down in the destruction and cracked the pavement and revealed these tunnels, which Josephus describes as tunnels in which Jewish rebels were hiding from the Romans, sometimes even starving to death. And they were eventually discovered and massacred. And you can visit there now. There's a way to get in there as part of the City of David National Park. So it's a lot going on here. And I'd like to turn your attention to one detail here, where these tourists are kind of crowded around a stone, which is a little bit hard to see, in which a piece of stone from the very top, from the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount, was discovered to have an inscription on top of it. And it was overlooked until then, because the paint came off, it fell down, nobody was looking. And I'm going to show that to you later on in the Israel Museum, but on the right here, you see an image of that fragment of stone, which has some writing on it. Now we're going to go into what it was, and that actually relates to something Laura was talking about. So we're going to get to that a little bit later, but that was found right over here. There's a replica of it which you can still see, but the original is in the Israel Museum. Now I would like to take you to the Herodian Quarter. Now the Herodian Quarter, you can see it's a little bit blurry because Google Earth does not really have a good resolution in Israel in general, but specifically in the Old City. It might be for security reasons. But you are looking right now at the Herodian Quarter, which is underneath Yeshivat HaKotel. So if you know Yeshivat HaKotel, it's the site underneath on your way to the main square. Now the Herodian Quarter, remember Herod the Great, who was like a half Jewish king. By the Romans, he was considered to be the king of the Jews, who built up the temple to be the marvel that it became. There was an entire area of Kohanim, and we know it was Kohanim because of the things we found inside. So I'd like to take you inside to show you a few pictures. So this is a 360. We can't really move around. We are now underneath Yeshivat HaKotel in a site which, again, was discovered. We're talking about after the destruction of the old city by the Jordanians in 1967, the Six-Day War. We come in and we start excavating and finding things. And so these are a lot of these clay and especially stone, many stone vessels. You can see like mugs made from stone, which were in these houses. Now, why stone? Halachically speaking, stones are not mekabel tum'ah. They do not absorb ritual impurity, and therefore you can use them if you have a sensitivity to purity. And one of the things which are characteristic of this period of time and this place is the heightened sensitivity to purity, ritual purity, tum'at met. And so a kohen who uses these vessels will not make them tamen, so you can keep on using them. And so stone is a very important element. And one of the reasons stone became so prevalent is because Herod the Great employed a tremendous amount of masons, of stone cutters, in order to build the temple. And so the price of stones came down. So you're looking now, you'll see more of them in the Israel Museum, but you can see here massive stone barrels underneath a table, which were used for food and other things inside a massive house. And what you can see here, a little bit difficult to see beyond the fence, is a little hole in the ground with stairs going down, which you can't see from here, which is a mikvah, a ritual bath. And there are several ritual baths, several mikvaot in the same house, because why would I bother going into the living room if I have a mikvah in my bedroom? This is upper class. This is the equivalent of, my other car is a Porsche, or having a flat screen TV with cable in every room. These are the most wealthiest people, the Kohanim. I'm going to show you another picture from inside here, further down. Again, you're looking at Yeshivat HaKotel's on top of us. And you can see the walls of what remains. And here is a mosaic. Now, mosaic stones are also a decorative element which comes from the Romans. And it's a symbol of wealth. Even though marble is more expensive and the temple floor was covered with marble, Chazal said that it was woven with blue and white marble in a way that it looks like the waves of the ocean, right? And we know a bit about the marble from the Temple Mount because of the Temple Mount sifting project, which is another story. So this is just to give you a glimpse inside the houses of the Kohanim. And now I would like to take you to the Israel Museum, where we get to see these things up close. So welcome to the Israel Museum. We are in the Israel Museum in the section dedicated to the Herodian period up to the destruction of Beitar by Bar Kokhba. So this is a broad area referred to generally as the Roman period. Before I show you these specific artifacts, I want to zoom in so you can see this picture of the Temple Mount. And you can see again up here, you see Robinson's Arch, here's Wilson's Arch. And this slab of stone is the one that was found, which we're going to look at very closely. In order to look at this very closely, I'm going to switch screens one more time. And I'm going to show it to you up here. So hopefully you should see it. Now, what exactly does this say? We have to remember that back in the day, people didn't have necessarily scribal training. Not everybody knew what they were doing. Some knew more, some knew less. The assumption is if you're carving this on the temple, you know what you're doing. So this is a better script than you would usually find in handwritten letters. So let's try to put it together, okay? So there are a few different ways to reconstruct this. The beginning is very clear. Levet hatiki'ah leha something. Let me go back. Lebet, you see lamed, bet, yud, taf. Ha teki'ah, the hey and the chet sometimes are interchangeable just because of the way they were stylized. Ha teki'ah, which has to do with blowing a trumpet or a shofar that Laura was talking about, blowing the trumpets and so on. And then there's a lamed, there's something which might be a hey, which might be a chaf, it might be a bet, we don't really know. And there are several suggestions. These are the 2 out of 4 most common ones. And Tamara Yardeni generally is involved in a lot of these. We'll see her coming up again and again. Tamara Yardeni, she's taken a lot of pictures which have to do with this. So, lebet atkiya lehachriz. Lehachriz means to announce, or lebet atkiya lehavdil, to separate. And the Mishnah in Sukkah and in several other places talks about how there was a tkiyah, just like we have today, the siren that tells you when shkia is, or candlelight, you know. It's the announcements of what time can you do this, when does Shabbat begin, when does it end, or to awaken people to do tshuva, or to tell people when a certain korban is being brought. Are we going to war? Are we involved in mourning? That's where, now let's put it together. So that came from the very top, the western and eastern corner, presumably, where it fell down from during the destruction. And you can see a simulation of what it looked like somebody standing up there, right, with a chatzotzra, with one of the trumpets, either lehachriz or lehavdil. So we are looking at one of the most important parts of the temple, which relate to our tradition about what happened in the temple and what its function was in terms of bringing people together and keeping people aware. Now, to our left is a reconstruction of the colors of the Arch of Titus, and we will get into that a little bit later. But the table there with the showbread table, which is described by Josephus in procession, which you see here, Roman soldiers carrying the temple vessels, right? Even though there's an old myth that it's the Jews carrying it, but that's a story we might get into later. And you can see that inside the table are 2 silver trumpets, chatzotzrot. Not only are they a recognizable part of the temple vessels, but in one of the coins of the Great Revolt, which usually displayed images of temple vessels, on the right hand we have some kind of instrument, like a kinnor, not the violin of today, like a harp. And on the left we have 2 silver chatzotzrot. Well, that's because the coin is silver. And the coin on the left says, Lecherut Yerushalayim, to the redemption of Jerusalem. These are coins of the Great Revolt against the Romans, eve of the destruction. So that's what we're looking at. Now, I'm going to take you back into the, before we go back into the museum, I want to show you a few other things. So the Herodian Quarter. I want to show you something that was found in the Herodian Quarter, which is currently in the Israel Museum, right next to the Beit HaTekiyah L'Achriz inscription, which I just showed you, and then we're going to go back to the museum soon to see it. Now, if you look carefully at this, this is part of what remains, a deep etching in plaster from the house of a Kohen. Now, there is an entire field of study about the menorah, and we don't have the time to get into it, but I will point out that the menorah here is a very artistic expression. It's not an exact copy of the menorah, but it also has the 2 altars in the Mizbech, in the temple, the Mizbech HaZahav, which was the small one on the top right, and Mizbech HaNechoshet, the copper altar for offerings, which was outside in the court, in the Ezrat Yisrael, Ezrat HaKohanim, and that was the bigger one, the copper altar, Mizbech HaNechoshet or Mizbech HaOlam. These were etched by a Kohen or in a Kohen's house by somebody who has seen it in their lifetime. This is somebody who saw the real thing. Maybe wasn't the best artist. You see how they continue the little shapes that are all over the branches of the menorah all the way into the tripod, the base, which is not accurate, but it's one of the earliest depictions and the earliest depiction that we know of a menorah that in so much detail, which is quite remarkable. And I want to point you again to the Arch of Titus, and here's the golden menorah. There's a whole discussion about the menorah of the Arch of Titus. We might get into it a little bit later, but before we go back into the museum, I want to show you 2 things which we found underneath our house in our basement while we were expanding it, doing some construction there. And since our house is built on top of a 2,700-year-old First Temple period wall, and our house was built after 1967, on top of it, there are a few layers of history in between. So one of the things that we found is an oil lamp, which is a pinched clay. This is an Iron Age lamp. This is typical of Beit Rishon period, the First Temple period. So we found that, but we also found ashes, probably some from furniture or house beams, that were burnt by the destruction of the Romans when they destroyed Yerushalayim 2,000 years ago. And we found that layer from the destruction layer underneath our house. And this is on display in my parents' home. We had the permission from the Antiquities Authority to keep some of this stuff. So this is what we're looking at. It's quite moving to be able to see this. And there is a custom on weddings to put ashes on the groom, puts ashes on the place of the tefillin, which is a place of remembering on your forehead, putting some ashes to remember the destruction, to remember the Churban. And we have a family custom to use these ashes for close family and friends. Please don't call my mother to ask for it, okay? She doesn't like when that happens. It's for family and friends, but we do that. It's fascinating. And one more thing I'm going to show you, just to tease your appetite. These are coins that we found. Now look at that image on the coin. And you ask yourself, is this a Jewish coin or is it not? Now we would be tempted to say yes, because it has a 6-pointed star, a Magen David. But this is actually a Muslim coin. The 6-pointed star, the Magen David, is only going to become a recognizable Jewish symbol over the last 500 years, and most prominently over the last about 200 years. We don't have the time to talk about that, but I hopefully will talk about it a little bit in the end. So that's that. Now let's get back into the museum. On. Okay, so we are now looking at Lebet Atkiya Achriz, and on the right here is the plaster from the house of the Kohanim, which I mentioned. And there's all kinds of other things going on here. I'm going to show you a few of them. So here is an inscription in Latin, part of the inscription from a soreg, from this, if you look at the temple courtyard, and there's kind of a short wall that surrounds the Azara, the main area, there was a border stone there that told non-Jews, that told Gentiles up until here, you cannot go beyond here. And that's in Latin, and that's a fascinating thing to see. Right, when you read Eicha, and it talks about how the place in which God said no Gentile shall be able to step in here because it's a very intimate place. Not everybody can go in there. Right now you have Shualim Hilchuba. Now there's foxes going through it. So that's very poignant. Looking around, this is Herodian Kohanic stone vessels from the Herodian temple. Big jugs for, who knows, wine or oil or whatnot. There's mosaics from the floor. And on. There's a lot of stone vessels if we go further on. And there's an entire area here dedicated to the destruction. The Arch of Titus is mentioned here. Coins from the Great Revolt. Here's mentioned Masada. There's even a milestone, a pillar here that mentions Vespasian. And there's one that mentions Titus as well. So we are looking at relics, remnants from the destruction. All right. I would like to take you to the next stop. And on that note, I'm going to take you now from the destruction, and we're going to be going into Rome. So we are looking right now at the Colosseum. The Colosseum is perhaps the most impressive building, most impressive sports building in the ancient world. It could host over 50,000 people, which is massive for those times, and it was built over several reigns. It started with Vespasian, continued into Domitian and Titus. They completed it over time. There was also a canopy on top of it. And the Colosseum, Josephus actually suggests that it was built by Jewish slaves because of the obscene amount of slaves, which brought down the price of slaves in the market. That's how many slaves were taken from Judea. So there's that discussion. Now let's move around the Colosseum. Now the Colosseum, we're going to get into some stories about it soon, but I want to point out to you that from the Colosseum, you can't actually see the Arch of Titus. There's a different arch here, which people actually confuse with the Arch of Titus. That's not what it is. It's part of the Roman Forum. And in the Forum, there used to be here what's called the Temple of Peace, in which the temple menorah, as well as other vessels, were put on display. Not only Jewish vessels from the conquered world, the Temple of Peace, in order to show the world, all the visitors to Rome, look what you can have if you stick to it, right? If we stay with the Roman Empire and we pay our taxes, what's called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and so on. And so there were all these on display, but around the year 190 something, it was burned on fire, etc. There's a whole question about what happened to them but that's the Colosseum. Now, the Colosseum, of course, we know today is a visitor site, and you also have concerts going on here. We can move around it on Street View a little bit, but we don't have that much time. But it's quite an impressive building. And what I would like to point out is a few things about the Colosseum. So the Colosseum was a place in which entertainment was in the form of gladiators and people fighting to the death or fighting animals to the death or being killed by animals, and that was entertainment. And one of the things that happened in the destruction of Jerusalem and Judea is a tremendous amount of Jews were serving as gladiators in order to be sport, entertainment for the Roman public, not only in Rome, also in Caesarea and so on, all the Roman and pagan cities around the Roman Empire. So there were these massive celebrations. So let's get into it. The Colosseum of Rome, and here's where I'd like to share with you something really, really nice. And Mirit, you would appreciate this because you mentioned the Bible, the BAR review, the Biblical Archaeology Review. So the Colosseum began being built. The first 3 tiers were built by Vespasian, Aspasianos. This is a coin of Vespasian, who was from the Flavian dynasty, who actually were lower class. They weren't from the aristocracy, and that's something that they actually used for their benefit. Now, think about the incredible amount of money which poured into the Roman Empire after the looting and spoils of Jerusalem, which, as we mentioned earlier, a tremendous amount of wealth was spent not only on building it, but also by visitors and other kings and governors and donations. It was a tremendous storehouse of gold and wealth. Vespasian ascends the throne right after the year of the 4 emperors, the last of which is Nero, who was a madman, who fiddled on the roof, as we see, while Rome was burning. He completely depleted the Roman treasury. They were in extreme debt, and the amount of money that was necessary in order to stabilize the economy is mentioned by Vespasian as, I think, about 100 million sesterce or something like that. We're talking about the largest amount of money ever mentioned in antiquity. And he managed to do it largely by the spoils of war from Jerusalem. And he minted these coins showing you the Colosseum. If you look carefully to the right, you'll see it says Vespasian, SPF, that's initials for different parts of the name and so on. This is Vespasian. And he built this massive Colosseum with all the excess money. He pays the soldiers. And one of the things which he and his sons, Domitian and Titus, do is all this propaganda around, look what we have succeeded in doing, vote for us. So, not really, I'm joking, but support us and so on. They needed the support. They needed to show the Roman people that they can recover the economy from the tremendous debt that was caused by Nero, who was hated. And he built himself a massive pool, which was filled in with concrete, and that's what the Colosseum is. It was filling in what the Roman Colosseum was, what his pool was. The Colosseum, this is, of course, a very famous this is a famous movie. I'm blanking out right now. Not Spartacus. I'm blanking out. That's Greek. But this is showing you the Colosseum in Rome. The most famous movie in most recent times is called Gladiator. And you see here Russell Crowe fighting gladiators. And there's tigers in there. And there's a lot of entertainment. One of the things that happened with gladiators, and this is actually has a halakhic implication. Can you go to these games? Jews living in Rome, right? There's been Jews living in Rome for 2,000 years. Can you go to these games? People are getting killed. What is this stuff? It's entertainment. It's not kosher. And the Talmud, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, it's Rabbi Meir actually says that the way this works is, especially there were many Jews who were gladiators. Remember that. How do you decide who lives and who dies? The crowd. If they support the guy and cheer him, he lives. And if not, he dies. You can save a life. You better go to the sports game, right? And there's a serious discussion. You can save a fellow Jew by going there and supporting, right? So that's quite an idea. Now, I'd like to take you into the Colosseum. So the Colosseum was actually called, as you can see on the top here, Amphitheatrum Flavium, because it was an amphitheater built by the Flavian kings, Vespasian, Domitian, Titus, right? The reason it was called the Colosseum probably is because Emperor Hadrian put a colossus, a statue of Nero, who was a hated emperor, outside, and sort of got that name. And these are all etchings, pictures from the Met, right? So here it's called the Colosseum Romano. Now, a discovery that was made by the Banca di Roma a while ago is that one of the entrances to the Colosseum is a dedication plaque, which is talking about some kind of reconstruction in the 5th or 6th century, maybe later. We'll see in a moment, exact details. And that is a plaque which describes whoever it was who donated to this. Now look carefully at this plaque from one of the entrances. If you look carefully at this plaque, you'll notice that there are a lot of holes in it, which have nothing to do with the writing. Those holes are ghost letters. What do I mean by ghost letters? There was a biblical archaeology review about this. Louis Feldman wrote an article about this, and I'm going to give you some details from that article, which he wrote in the Biblical Archaeology Review a few years ago. I think not 10 years ago. No, not 20 years ago. Is that those holes were actually, there were metal or bronze letters that were hammered into it. The original plaque, they fell out and new letters were inscribed on it. So if you can remove the new words and just look at those dots, let's do that. Connecting the dots. So here's the new inscription. Now, Geza Alfoldi, a specialist in reconstructing ghost inscriptions, was able to figure out what those words could have been. But I'm not going to go into all the details, but what Louis Feldman points out is that despite this guy was an expert, there is another possible interpretation, which, without going into all the details, which points out what the original plaque actually said. And there's a little bit of a question for interpretation. So we've now cleaned the slate. We're looking at the old inscription. In order to figure out what it said, you need to also be able to compare. What did other inscriptions of the time actually say? What kind of things were written on them? What part was initials? How much money did they give? When did they give it? Who was the father? Why did they do it? What year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lot of work in order to reconstruct this. And what they figured out, and the green and the red are the two different versions of how to reconstruct it. But basically what they discovered is that this is built by Vespasian, and Titus added a T later to include. You can see imp is like short for imperator, the emperor. T is the Titus, he kind of stuck that in. Case is Caesar, Vespasianus, that's his full name, Augustus, right? There's no V, it's a U. Amphitheatrum novum, so on and on and on. Ex manubis. And ex manubis means from the spoils of war. What spoils of war? And Louis Feldman goes into a whole conversation about it. Which conquests were the Flavian kings doing? I mean, the generals doing is Chandra, and he comes to the conclusion that it must be from the spoils of war of Judea, of Jerusalem. That's the only explanation. And it works with all of the other Roman historians and Josephus and so on, who discuss the immense amount of wealth which was poured into the kingdom. The price of gold in the empire dropped by, I think, a third or 2/3 because of the amount of gold from Jerusalem that was poured into the empire. And so it stands to reason that this was built from the spoils of war of Jerusalem. Amazing, right? Now, one last stop in Rome. Let us go now to the most famous Arch of Titus. So the Arch of Titus is in the Via Sacra, the Holy Path. It's straight ahead. This is the Arch of Titus. Let's go ahead and see it. Makes you wish that Jerusalem was done in 3D like this too. One day. Okay, so this is the Arch of Titus. Now the Arch of Titus, of course, was reconstructed many times. This isn't necessarily the original exact location, the original exact structure, but many parts of it are. I want to bring you really, really up close to it. Let's go to the Arch of Titus. Okay. What just happened? It happens sometimes. With all the excitement, we jumped out of the earth. Okay, so I'm going to take this little yellow guy and show us a little bit of street view of the Arch of Titus. Now, the Arch of Titus was, forgive what I said about location. What I was trying to say is that we know from Josephus that during the parades in which the spoils of war from Jerusalem were displayed to the public and the prisoners of war were paraded, and Shimon Bar Giora, one of the leaders of the rebellion, was paraded and eventually executed, and the menorah and all those things which are described in the procession happened under a temporary archway in which we were paraded both for the victory of Rome and to sort of, put us down. And this one was built a little bit later. So I'd like to take you just really up close to show you, try to get an inside view of the Arch of Titus. Here we go. So on the left-hand side here, you have Titus with his quadriga, the 4 horses, with Nike. It's a little hard to see from here, but the goddess of victory on top of him blessing him. And here to the other side, we have the very famous image of the spoils of Jerusalem. And this is the Arch of Titus. Now, in order to really appreciate it, you have to actually stand there during the day and watch the light move around it and see how it looks like it's moving, which is something that you don't notice when you're just standing there and looking at it. You have to put a camera on a tripod there and let it record the whole day. And then fast forward, and then you'll appreciate it, and it fits in with the description of the procession. It comes to life. But it comes to life more prominently if we add one detail, which has been recently confirmed, but was known about the Roman world, that their images were in color. So let's build up to this. So what we are looking at right now is a coin called a Judea Capta, which is a special coin minted by Vespasian to celebrate the subjugation of Judah. And there are several versions of this. Look to the right. You'll see a soldier standing with his armor and helmet to his left, and there's a palm tree representing Judea. And to the right, there is a weeping woman which represents Judea. And the Roman world generally anthropomorphized. They made ideas, countries, seasons as people. And to the left, you have Vespasian. This one is from the Metropolitan Museum. It's a different version of it. And look, Judea Capta, captured Jerusalem, Yerushalayim Hashvuya, or Yehuda Hashvuya. Now we're going to start going back to Jerusalem and exploring how these concepts, these ideas were etched on our memory and used with the revival, with the miracle of the return to Eretz Israel. So let's start with this one. Look at this picture, look at the dates. Yom HaAtzmaut, Hey Be'Iyar, this is the first Yom HaAtzmaut, the first Israel Independence Day after 1948. This is 1949. The year 70, you have the Judea Capta, and to the right, Tzva Hagana Israel, the Jewish army with the sword and the olive branch, and on top the emblem of the Strait of Israel, which has the menorah from the Arch of Titus, which we'll get into too. So that's 70 and that's 1948. Look at the awareness of it. I'm just going to show you briefly a few examples. So these are special medallions that were made. On the top, you have a Judea Capta, and on the bottom, you have 2 versions of a medallion. On the right, it says Yehuda HaMeshuchreret. The woman, or Judea, gets up and breaks her shackles and chases the soldier away. And on the left-hand side, you have the olive branch, the palm tree that is with people, with a man planting a tree and a woman lifting a baby. Continuum, renewal, we are back home. And one cute anecdote, this is from the home of Bialik in Tel Aviv, where he has the Judea Capta and Yehuda Meshucheret on both sides of the pillars of one of his rooms in his study. So that's really, really cool. Now let's go to the Arch of Titus. Around 2012, Yeshiva University and my professor, Stephen Fein, who I've taken several courses with at Revel Graduate School and Yeshiva University, he discovered, based on his assumption that there are colors here, based on studies from the Roman world, let's go and find them. And they were able to scan it in 3D and actually locate the gold, remnants of the gold paint of the menorah. The rest of this is a suggested reconstruction. Of course, this looks like the day it was painted. Obviously, there was wear and tear and shading and so on. You see the Roman soldiers carrying all of it. So that's in color. In color, it's quite a fascinating thing, right? Now, I want to start wrapping up, and to take us from here back to Yerushalayim, back to the modern state of Israel, back to our modern sentiments of how we are brought back to life and rise from the ashes. So this Arch of Titus was actually the symbol of our destruction and our humiliation. And the Jews of Rome hated it. In 1947, with the UN partition plan of 29th of November, which is curiously called Chavtet B'November, it's kind of a funny way to call it. The UN partition plan announced the state of Israel, and the Jews of Rome gathered around there, and the chief rabbi actually stood there and he was speechless. He didn't even know what to say. And they had a ceremonial march in the opposite direction because we came in, paraded in from Jerusalem to Rome, even though that arch wasn't actually the one, but it's symbolic. They marched the other way around. And there's many, many ideas in which the posters and artistic descriptions of Jewish soldiers carrying the menorah, walking the other way around. This is very, very powerful, this imagery. And I want to take this to current events. So first of all, just some humor. This is from Haaretz this week. If you haven't heard about the protests, I'm not going to go into the details of what that woman is doing on top of the menorah, but I'm just going to say it was very inappropriate. But this is taking that and making fun of it in a way. It's a very, very sad story with everything that's going on currently in Israeli society. You know, I live a few minutes away from the Prime Minister's house. I see these things. It's you know, what's going on is pretty terrible in general. And they're showing the Arch of Titus imagery, but it says here, instead of the symbols, the signs which talk about this is the Torah, this is the menorah, this is the vessels, it's saying resign, you guys are detached, we're disgusted with you, go home, you're corrupt and angry people. So that's kind of current events, but let's take it somewhere more serious. So I actually took this picture especially for you. This is on the bottom of Keren HaYesod, right next to the Inbal Hotel. And this is a new monument that's up there to commemorate Zev Jabotinsky. And this is his movement Kadima, which has the menorah. And the menorah, as we'll see throughout history, there's many examples. This is from the Byzantine period or the Roman period, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. The menorah became the symbol, the iconic symbol of our connection, our yearning for the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem and its glory. And there are other images there as well. On the top, there's an ark with scrolls sitting inside it. There's a shofar, there's a lulav and etrog. There's all kinds of other things here. This is a Jewish catacomb in Rome. So the menorah became, towards the end of the Second Temple, but mostly after the destruction, the iconic symbol of Judaism, in a way. It's on cemeteries, it's in shuls, right? That was the symbol, right? And so here, the Beit Alpha synagogue as well, and again in the north, very, very famous menorahs and lions and all kinds of fun stuff. So let's wrap this up before we go back to Jerusalem. So we now have a committee, okay? We have the committee, the modern state of Israel. We want to design a flag. Why? Because that's what you're doing now in Eastern Europe with all these nationalist sentiments. So the first Zionist Congress of 1897, which was started by Theodor Herzl, and many of the Zionist leaders of the world gathered together to talk about how do we solve the problem of anti-Semitism. We need a solution for the Jews, all that conversation. This is the flag that they came up with. This is the flag of the first Zionist Congress of 1897. Now look at what they did. There's the Lion of Judah. There's the Star of David, which was a symbol which became identified with Judaism, even though it's a geometric shape, which comes from mysticism, not to be confused with the words Magen David. The shape which was associated and connected with those words is the six-pointed star. That's a separate conversation, but it became called the Star of David, even though it used to be called Chotam Shlomo, and they were back and forth. Now there's 7 small yellow stars of David inside and one on top. Why 7? Because of the menorah. 7 branches of the menorah of the temple, not 8, which is the one of Hanukkah, including a shamash, it can be 9. So there's 7 Magen Davids. So all these symbols which have to do with Judah. But now after that, so there actually was a committee, Vadat HaSemel, to come up with a semel, with a symbol for the state of Israel. These are some of many suggestions. They're playing with the blue and white, with the talit. They're playing with the gold of the menorah, and they're playing with the number 7 because of the 7 branches of the menorah. And eventually, the one that we know was chosen was this one. But that's our flag. The symbol of Medinat Israel was actually the menorah from the Arch of Titus. And I'm going to make a long story short, but there was a huge controversy about this because the base of the menorah is a typical Roman lampstand. And if you remember the one that's etched, the menorah that's etched by a person who saw the temple in the Herodian Quarter, it's actually a tripod. And all of our sources support that. There's no support for this. What most likely it is as Professor Stephen Fine of Yeshiva University points out, is that many donations were made to the temple. The menorah, which looked most recognizable as a lampstand to Romans, and the Arch of Titus was made for Romans, had that base, or they sort of fitted into that base for the ceremonial procession. There's no necessity that it was actually like this, despite the fact that my high school Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, the founder of the Temple Institute, built it like this, and it's in the center of the Jewish quarter right now, right, in the old city. Fine. The olive branches on the side, by the way, are from the vision from Zechariah, which talks about 2 olive trees pouring oil into a menorah, referring to Jewish revival through the endurance of the spirit, as opposed to power of the arm. It's not by might or by strength, but rather by Hashem's spirit that we are revived. So it's taking all the symbols and putting it together. Now I'd like to take you back to Israel with this famous menorah outside the Knesset. Now, the menorah outside the Knesset was actually intended to be, we're going to take you there in a moment, inside the Knesset, and the design, look, it's inside in the center. The chief rabbi of Israel and many more people had objection to it, said, take this menorah, put it somewhere else, make them feel good about it. The British gave this to Israel in 1956, as appreciation for the young state. We're not going to talk about the history we had beforehand with England, right? And as an appreciation, and there's beautiful images of all kinds of stories from Jewish history all around that. We can do a whole talk just about that. I encourage you to look up the Knesset menorah even on Wikipedia. It's very, very well done. But it wasn't put in the Knesset. It was actually put outside. So let's take you straight to there, and that will be our last point. On the menorah in the garden. And here we are, our final stop. This menorah is the menorah which was given by England to Israel. It was actually designed by a German Jewish artist. And there's all kinds of scenes, I think dozens of scenes, I don't remember the exact number, all around it on each side. And each scene is a story from Jewish history, a formative story. You have stories of destruction and then stories of rebuilding. And this menorah is actually facing, let's move around so you can see it, facing the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. There you are. That's the Knesset. And it's in the rose garden, the wall rose garden. And so what we've done now is gone really full circle from the destruction of the temple and the looting of the temple and the capturing of its symbols, which were used, its vessels, which were used as symbols of subjugation and putting us down, were used now as the symbols of our rebuilding. And that was done consciously by the state of Israel, by many Jews, in order to show that michurban legeula, from destruction to redemption. And so the menorah became the symbol of the state of Israel, a symbol of hope. It connects us back to the menorah of the temple, to the light of the temple, to the wisdom and the light which was Jerusalem, and which we hopefully will be celebrating, hopefully this year in Yerushalayim. That's putting it all together. So what we've seen is the Jerusalem, eve of the destruction, the magnificent temple of Jerusalem, different places which showed the lavishness of Jerusalem, the sensitivity to purity, ritual purity, and so on. And eventually the destruction, and how the destruction of the temple fueled and funded the Colosseum, and was served to support the Flavian dynasty and to have people support the Roman Empire. It actually built up the Roman Empire from their economic crisis, which they had earlier, and brought Rome up to where it was. But eventually Rome fell, Jerusalem rose again, and we are now celebrating, hopefully we will be celebrating in Jerusalem with Yerushalayim HaBnuyah and Beit HaMikdash, but we are celebrating the revival of Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael as it never has been before. And this connection to the symbols helps us recognize where we come from and hopefully where we're going. So I'm gonna stop share, but that was the whole tour. I want to thank you all very much. And I'm gonna turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robbie Freed from Amit, and I want to thank Nachliel for this incredible presentation. Really, we are wowed every time we learn with you. Thank you for taking us both virtually to travel through time and space with you. It really made us feel like we were there, and it was very meaningful. Thank you also, Laura, for your very moving reflections on Tisha B'Av and Tu B'Shvat. We want to thank everyone for joining us for this program that really honors the memory of Eleanore Greenberg, Anita Scharf, and it's in honor of Yehudit, Greenspan, and Shelley Wolf. I hope that you can join us for future programs that we will have in our email to you, and thanking you for joining us today. And I wish you all a meaningful fast, and I hope this program enhanced this period for you. Our next program coming up is called What It's Worth, which is a program that helps you evaluate items that you might have in your home, and to think about maybe something for the Antique Roadshow eventually. Anyways, thank you, and we really appreciate it. We will send you the recording in our notes of things.
And not just to say that a couple of people had asked about Nachliel's classes. So Nachliel, if you have I guess a website or something on yours, we'll send that in the follow-up.
Yes, thank you. It's very easy to remember. It's museumtours.co.il or museumtoursisrael.com. The site's ready to go. It's being built, but it's good enough, and all my information is there. You can just hit a button and WhatsApp me or email me or ask questions and see what I do. So you'll
And
be able
Nachliel,
to.
are you aware that the Center for Jewish History, speaking of YU, has a relief of the Arch of Titus that Dr. Fine helped?
What I didn't have a chance to mention, I studied specifically a course on the menorah with Stephen Fine. He's my mentor as well. I've done 4 courses with him at YU. So they actually did the scanning of the Arch of Titus and made a carving of it, a 3D carving, which weighs, I don't remember how, half a ton, I don't remember, out of plastic. And it used to be in the Center for Jewish History at an exhibit of this name. It's currently in the first hall, which is in Yeshiva University. You can go in and see it, and they actually project the colors onto it, and then it moves off. And it's behind the guard. Nobody, people just walk by and don't pay attention. It's just right there with all the plaque and the images of the coins. So yes, I've seen it many, many times.
All right. Well, hope everyone has an easy fast and a meaningful fast. Certainly we have a lot to food for thought thanks to both of your presentations. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you soon at our next events.